I stood outside the auditorium that morning, my tie just a little too tight, my hands trembling with a pride I had carried for 22 years. My boy was graduating, the first in our family to earn a college degree. I thought he'd swing by, call out "Dad," the way he used to, and walk me inside. Instead, I watched as he stepped out of a sleek black car with his mother and her new husband, their laughter floating across the parking lot like a language I no longer understood. He didn't look my way. He didn't even call my name. I waited, holding on to the hope that maybe he'd turn. Maybe he'd remember I was still his father. But hope can be a cruel thing. If you've ever felt that kind of wound, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. I woke up that morning before my alarm, the way you do when something important waits ahead of you. The house was quiet in that particular way it gets at dawn, not empty, just holding its breath. I lay there for a moment, listening to the familiar creaks of the old place, thinking about all the mornings I'd gotten up early for him. School mornings when he was 8 and couldn't find his backpack. Saturday mornings driving him to Little League when other fathers were sleeping in. Emergency mornings when he had the flu and needed soup at 3 a.m. 20-2 years of mornings, and this one felt different. Final, somehow. I remember the years that led to this day, like they were chapters in a book I'd been writing without knowing it. The carpools where he'd fall asleep in the passenger seat, his football gear scattered around him, grass stains on his knees. Those late nights at the kitchen table, both of us hunched over science projects that were due the next day, me pretending I understood chemistry while he explained it to me with the patience only children have for their parents' ignorance. There were the secret envelopes too, small b. Ills tucked away in a shoebox behind my winter clothes. Money I'd saved by skipping lunches, by driving the old car just a little longer, by saying no to myself so I could say yes to him. College fund money, emergency money, money for the things that mattered to a boy becoming a man. He never knew about those envelopes, never felt the weight of my struggles, because that's what fathers do. We carry the weight so our children can run free. His graduation wasn't just his achievement, it was mine too, in the quiet way that parents claim their children's victories. Every A on a report card, every goal he scored, every time he made the right choice when I wasn't watching, these were the dividends of all those early mornings, all those sacrificed Saturday afternoons, all those times I chose being his father over being anything else. I made coffee in the kitchen where I'd made him breakfast for 12 years of school mornings. The counter still had the ring stains from his cereal bowls, faint circles that I'd never bothered to scrub away completely. Now I was glad I hadn't. They were proof he'd been here, proof this house had been a home. Outside, I could see my old car waiting in the driveway. She wasn't much to look at anymore. The paint faded to a color that wasn't quite blue, wasn't quite gray, but she'd been faithful. She'd carried us to every football practice, every parent-teacher conference, every emergency room visit when he broke his wrist climbing that oak tree in the backyard. The passenger seat was worn smooth from all the times he'd sat there, from child to teenager to young man, growing taller season by season until his knees pressed against the glove compartment. I thought about something while I was getting dressed. If you'd like to hear the rest of this story, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. And if you've been where I was that morning, share your experience in the comments. Sometimes we need to know we're not alone in these quiet heartbreaks. Before I left the house, I went to my dresser and opened the top drawer. There, wrapped in the same velvet cloth it had rested in for 30 years, was my father's watch. It was a simple thing, really. Silver, with a white face, the kind of watch working men wore when watches meant something. My father had given it to me on my wedding day, his hands shaking slightly as he fastened the clasp around my wrist. "Time is all we really give each other," he'd said that day. "Make sure you give him enough of yours." I'd worn that watch through my son's childhood, checking it during his baseball games to make sure I wasn't late picking him up, glancing at it during long work meetings when I was counting the minutes until I could get home to help with homework. It had counted the seconds of his life that I was privileged to witness, the hours I spent being his father. Now it was time to pass it on. I placed it carefully in the small leather box I'd bought for the occasion, the same kind of box my father had used for me. The watch nestled perfectly in the silk lining, waiting to continue its journey through the generations of our family. Father to son, time passed like a sacred trust. I walked out to the car with the box in my hand, feeling the weight of it. Not just the physical weight of the watch, but the emotional weight of tradition, of hope, of the belief that some things endure even when everything else falls apart. I placed it carefully on the passenger seat, right where he used to sit when he was small enough to need a booster seat, right where he'd sat just a few years ago when I taught him to drive. As I started the engine, I thought about the promise I'd whispered to myself during the divorce 3 years ago. The lawyers were dividing everything else: the house, the savings, the furniture we'd bought together when we still believed in forever. But there was one thing that couldn't be divided by courts or custody agreements. I would always be his father. No matter what happened between his mother and me, no matter who else might enter their lives, that bond was unbreakable. Or so I believed. The morning sun slanted through my windshield as I pulled out of the driveway, softer than usual somehow. It looked almost golden, like it was blessing this day, blessing this moment when my son would walk across a stage and into his future. I took it as a good sign, this gentle light warming my face as I drove toward what I thought would be one of the proudest moments of my life. I didn't know then that the same sun would expose truths I wasn't ready to face. I didn't know that light can reveal shadows as easily as it can chase them away. All I knew was that I was a father driving to see his son graduate, carrying with me all the love and hope and accumulated joy of 22 years. The watchbox rode beside me like a promise, and I was so sure that by evening it would be on his wrist where it belonged. The road stretched out ahead of me like a ribbon of possibility, highway lines ticking by in steady rhythm. It should have been the most joyful drive of my life, but something heavy settled in my chest as I left my neighborhood behind. Not sadness exactly, more like the feeling you get when you realize you've forgotten something important but can't remember what. The distance to the university was 93 miles. I'd driven it dozens of times over the past 4 years. Move-in day freshman year with a car packed so full we could barely see out the back window. Parents' weekend visits when he still seemed happy to see me. Spring break pickups when he'd grown taller and somehow more distant with each semester. But this drive felt different. Final. My ex-wife and I hadn't spoken in 3 months. The last conversation we'd had was brief. Practical. Something about his insurance coverage, the kind of administrative detail that divorces reduce love to. She'd answered the phone with that careful politeness she used now, like I was a stranger she was obligated to be nice to. When I mentioned the graduation ceremony, there was a pause that lasted just a beat too long. "You're coming?" she'd asked, and something in her tone made my stomach tighten. "Of course I'm coming. He's my son, too." Another pause. "Well, you should know that David will be there." David. Her husband now. The man who'd been dating her for 6 months before our divorce was even final, though she swore it hadn't started until after. The man who lived in what used to be our house, who ate breakfast at what used to be my table, who had somehow become a stepfather to my son without anyone asking my permission. My son's text messages had grown shorter over the past year. Where they used to be full of details about classes and friends and weekend plans, now they were efficiency itself. "Thanks for the money. Can't talk. Studying. Everything's fine." When I called, he often didn't answer, and when he did, there was something in his voice. Not hostility exactly, but distance. The kind of careful distance you maintain with someone you're trying not to hurt while pulling away. I kept telling myself it was just youth, just the natural process of a boy becoming a man, learning to stand on his own feet. All sons pull away from their fathers eventually. It's part of growing up, part of becoming independent. The fact that it happened to coincide with the divorce, with his mother's remarriage, with David's presence in their lives, that was just timing. Unfortunate timing. But as I drove those 93 miles, the doubts crept in like morning fog. The way he'd started calling me by my first name sometimes instead of Dad. The way he'd mentioned David's advice about his major, David's help with his job search, David's opinions about his future. Small things, but they accumulated like small cuts, each one barely noticeable until you realize you're bleeding. I kept rehearsing what I'd say when I saw him after the ceremony. "I'm proud of you, son. No matter what happens, no matter who else comes and goes in your life, I'm proud of you, and I love you." The words echoed in the quiet cabin of my car like a prayer, like an incantation against whatever forces were pulling him away from me. No matter what, I said aloud to the empty car, and my voice sounded smaller than I wanted it to. At a red light in some small town whose name I didn't catch, I glanced over at the watch box on the passenger seat. My father's hands had shaken when he gave it to me. Not from age, he was only 58 then, but from the weight of the moment, the transfer of something precious from one generation to the next, the physical embodiment of time and love and continuity. Now my hands were shaking too as I gripped the steering wheel, not from nervousness about the ceremony itself, but from something I couldn't quite name. A premonition, maybe. The sense that I was driving towards something that would change everything, though I couldn't imagine what. The last 20 miles took me through farmland, past fields where corn stood in neat rows like an army at attention. I'd grown up in country like this, learned to drive on roads like this with my own father beside me, his patient voice guiding me through the mysteries of clutch and brake, of checking mirrors, of the thousand small responsibilities that come with controlling something powerful enough to carry you away from everything you know. I thought about all the times I'd taught my son similar lessons, not just driving, though that too. The Saturday afternoon when he was 15, and we spent 3 hours in an empty parking lot while he learned to parallel park, both of it, laughing when he finally got it right. But bigger lessons too. How to throw a curveball, how to tie a tie, how to apologize when you're wrong, how to stand up for someone smaller than you, how to be a man who other people can count on. Had those lessons stuck, or had they been overwritten by someone else's voice, someone else's guidance? The questions tormented me as I covered the final miles, the university's buildings growing larger on the horizon like a destination I wasn't sure I was welcome to reach. I arrived early, parking under an old oak tree where I thought he'd be sure to see me when he came out of the building. I wanted him to know I was there, that I hadn't missed this moment, that nothing could keep me away from celebrating this achievement we'd worked toward together for so many years. The campus was beautiful in the morning light, brick buildings that had stood for more than a century, trees that had watched thousands of young people walk across stages and into their futures. I should have felt part of something larger, something timeless. Instead, I felt like an outsider looking through a window at a celebration I wasn't sure I belonged to. Other families were arriving, parents and siblings and grandparents carrying flowers and balloons, cameras and pride and uncomplicated joy. They looked like they knew their place in the day ahead, like they were expected, welcomed, essential to the story being told. I sat in my car with the watch box in my lap, watching them stream past, wondering if my son would look for me among the crowd, or if he'd already learned not to expect me in the important moments. I had no way of knowing that in a few hours I'd have my answer, that by evening I'd understand exactly where I stood in my son's life, and it wasn't where I'd thought at all. The oak tree's branches rustled overhead, and I took it as encouragement. I was here, I'd made it. Whatever happened next, I'd shown up for my son on the most important day of his young life. I just didn't know why. At that, showing up and being seen are two entirely different things. The auditorium buzzed with the particular energy that comes when hundreds of families gather to celebrate the same moment from different angles. Voices echoed off the high ceiling, a symphony of pride and excitement and barely contained emotion. Balloons bobbed against the air-conditioning vents, their ribbons dancing like streamers at a parade. Camera flashes popped like fireflies, everyone trying to capture moments that would matter more in memory than in pixels. I made my way through the crowd, the watch box secure in my jacket pocket, my eyes scanning every face for the one that mattered most. Parents hugged their graduating children, adjusting caps and smoothing gowns with the tender fussiness that comes from knowing this ritual marks an ending as much as a beginning. Grandparents dabbed at their eyes with tissues, overcome by the simple miracle of witnessing another generation step into adulthood. I found a spot near the steps leading up to the stage area, close enough to see clearly but far enough back to avoid the main crush of families. From here, I could watch him arrive, catch his eye, let him know I was present for this moment we'd both worked toward for so many years. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, casting everything in golden light that made even the nervous young graduates look like they were starring in their own movies. And then I saw him. My breath caught in my throat the way it had when he took his first steps, when he scored his first goal, when he walked across the stage at high school graduation 3 years ago. But this time was different. He wasn't the boy I'd been carrying in my memory. He was a man now. tall and straight-shouldered in his cap and gown, the morning light catching the sharp line of his jaw, the confident way he carried himself through the seat. Rowed. For one heartbeat, one perfect suspended moment, I thought he saw me. His eyes seemed to sweep across the crowd and pause just for an instant in my direction. I raised my hand slightly, started to smile, felt my heart lift with the anticipation of recognition, of connection, of the simple joy that comes when your child finds you in a crowd and knows you're there for them. But then he turned away. Not toward me, but toward another part of the gathering crowd, where his mother stood next to a man I recognized but had never wanted to see in this context. David, her husband, wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than I made in a month, his silver hair perfectly styled, his smile confident and proprietary as he reached up to adjust my son's cap with the casual familiarity of someone who belonged in that moment. My son let him do it. Stood still while another man performed the small, intimate gesture that should have been mine. Let him fuss with the tassel, straighten the collar of his gown beneath, place a paternal hand on his shoulder like he had every right to be proud, like he had earned the privilege of claiming credit for this moment. The smile died on my lips. My raised hand felt suddenly foolish, so I let it fall to my side and tried to make the gesture look casual, like I'd just been adjusting my tie or checking my watch. But inside, something was crumbling with the quiet devastation that comes when you realize you're not part of a story you thought you were helping to write. That should have been me. I should have been the one smoothing his gown, checking his cap, sharing some last-minute piece of fatherly wisdom before he walked across that stage. I was the one who'd sat through parent-teacher conferences, who'd helped him choose his classes, who'd worried about his grades and celebrated his successes and stayed up late listening to his teenage anxieties about the future. Every instinct I had screamed at me to step forward, to walk through that crowd and claim my place beside my son, to put my hand on his other shoulder, to remind everyone present, including him, that I was his father, that I had been there first, that my love for him predated every other relationship in that building. But I stayed where I was, rooted in place by something I couldn't quite name. Shame, maybe, or the terrible fear that stepping forward would create a scene, would embarrass him, would force him to choose between his parents in public, and risk him choosing against me. The thought of that rejection, played out in front of hundreds of strangers, was more than I could bear. So I adjusted my tie instead, straightened my shoulders, tried to look like a man who belonged there, like someone who had every right to be proud and excited and part of this celebration. I told myself he would see me later, after the ceremony, that there would be time for congratulations and photographs and the passing of the watch from my father to his grandson. But even as I tried to convince myself, I could feel something shifting inside me, some fundamental understanding of my place in his life, rearranging itself into a new and painful configuration. I watched him laugh at something David said, watched him turn to his mother with an expression of pure happiness, watched him move through the crowd like a young man surrounded by family and love and belonging. I wasn't part of that circle. I was outside it, looking in, trying to convince myself that I still mattered, that 22 years of fatherhood couldn't be erased by divorce papers and second marriages, and the simple passage of time. The crowd around me shifted and flowed as families found their seats for the ceremony. I let myself be carried along, still watching my son from a distance, still hoping he might turn and search for me, still believing that blood and history and all those years of bedtime stories and baseball games had to count for something. But as I found an empty seat in the back section, far from where his mother and David were settling into what were obviously reserved spots in the front rows, I felt myself fading from the picture like a photograph left too long in sunlight, present but growing fainter, visible but somehow less real, until I wasn't sure anymore if I was really there, or just the ghost of a father who used to matter in his son's story. The ceremony was about to begin, and I was exactly where I'd always been lately, on the outside, looking in, hoping to catch a glimpse of the life my son was building without me. The ceremony began with the processional, a river of black gowns flowing into the auditorium while a brass ensemble played something appropriately solemn and celebratory. I watched from my seat in the back, my program clutched in my hands, his name highlighted in yellow marker like I might somehow miss it when they called him forward. Around me, families leaned forward in anticipation, cameras ready, whispered conversations about how proud they were, how far their children had come. I should have felt part of that collective pride, that shared joy of parents watching their children reach a milestone that once seemed impossibly distant. Instead, I felt like I was watching through glass, present, but separated from the real celebration happening several rows ahead, where his mother sat next to David, both of them glowing with the particular radiance that comes from being exactly where you belong. Dot. The dean of the college took the podium and began the formal remarks about achievement and perseverance and the bright futures awaiting these young graduates. His words washed over me like distant music, pleasant but unimportant background noise to the real drama playing out in my chest. My heart was pounding with anticipation and dread in equal measure, counting down the moments until I would hear my son's name called, until I could finally release the pride I'd been carrying like held breath for the past 4 years. Dot. They called the names in alphabetical order, each graduate walking across the stage to polite applause, some families cheering more enthusiastically than others. I listened to the rhythm of it. Name, pause, applause, name, pause, applause, waiting for the moment when everything else would disappear and it would be just me, drowning in pride, watching my son receive the diploma we'd both earned through years of sacrifice and determination. Dot. And then they called his name. Dot. The sound of it echoing through the auditorium hit me like a physical force. My chest swelled with emotion so powerful it almost knocked me backward, tears pricking my eyes as I watched him stride across that stage with the confidence I'd spent 22 years helping him build. This was my son, my boy, the baby I'd held at 3 a.m. when he couldn't sleep, the toddler I'd taught to ride a bike, the teenager I'd stayed up late talking to about girls and grades and what he wanted to be when he grew up. I clapped harder than I'd ever clapped for anything, my hands coming together with a sound that felt like thunder in my ears. For a moment, nothing else existed. Not the divorce, not David, not the growing distance between us. There was only this, my son achieving something magnificent, and me witnessing it, and the pure joy that comes from watching someone you love succeed. Dot. But my applause sounded hollow in the vast space, lost among hundreds of other families celebrating their own children. And as the moment stretched on, I realized something that cut through my joy like a blade. He wasn't looking for me. His eyes swept across the audience, but they went straight to the front rows, straight to where his mother and David were on their feet, cheering like they'd won the lottery. David had his hands cupped around his mouth, shouting something I couldn't hear over the general applause. His mother was crying happy tears, one hand pressed to her chest, the other waving, like she was trying to send all her love across the distance between the audience and the stage. They looked like what they were, the proud parents of a graduating son, the family unit that mattered, the people whose approval and presence meant everything to the young man accepting his diploma. I kept clapping, kept trying to catch his eye, kept hoping he would scan the crowd until he found me and saw that I was there too, that I cared just as much, that my pride was just as real even if it was quieter, even if it came from the back rows instead of the front. Dot. But he never looked my way, not once. He smiled and waved at his mother and David, held up his diploma for them to see, mouthed something that made his mother laugh and cry harder at the same time. Then he walked off the stage and into the rest of his life, and I was nothing more than another face in a crowd of strangers. I wanted to shout then, wanted to stand up and call out, I was there too! I helped raise him, I sacrificed for him, I earned the right to be proud. Wanted to remind him and everyone else in that auditorium that before David, before the new family configuration that seemed to work so well without me, there had been a father who'd loved him first and longest and most completely. Dot. But the words caught in my throat like they were made of sand. What right did I have to disrupt his moment of triumph with my own need for recognition? What kind of father makes his son's graduation about his own hurt feelings? So I swallowed the shout, swallowed the protest, swallowed the desperate need to matter that was burning in my chest like acid. Dot. The pride I'd felt moments before turned bitter in my mouth, transforming from joy into something darker and more complicated. It tasted like ash, like the residue of something that had burned down while I wasn't looking. I was proud of him. That hadn't changed, would never change. But the pride felt hollow now, meaningless, like applauding for a movie. You're watching on television instead of living the story yourself. I sank back into my seat as they moved on to the next name, the next graduate, the next family's moment of triumph. Around me, the celebration continued with its rhythm of names and applause and joy, but I felt separate from it now, like I was watching from outside a window. The other families belonged here. Their presence mattered. Their pride counted. Mine was just noise in the back of the room. As the ceremony continued, I realized what I was witnessing wasn't just my son's graduation. It was my own quiet erasure, made public for anyone who cared to notice. The careful way he'd avoided looking in my direction wasn't accidental. The front row seats reserved for family hadn't included me, not because of oversight, but because I was no longer considered essential to his story. Somehow, without my noticing exactly when or how it happened, I had become optional in my son's life. A guest rather than family. Someone who might show up or might not, whose presence was neither expected nor particularly welcome, whose absence wouldn't really be felt by anyone who mattered. The recognition hit me like a physical blow, stealing my breath and making my hands shake as I gripped the program with his name highlighted in yellow marker. I had come here expecting to celebrate our achievement, his and mine together. Instead, I was witnessing the formal conclusion of my relevance in his life. The ceremonial transfer of his loyalty and love and future from the man who had raised him to the one who would stand beside him going forward. The ceremony ended with the traditional tossing of caps into the air, hundreds of mortarboards flying up toward the ceiling in a moment of pure celebration and release. I watched them fall like black snow, each one representing a young person ready to step into their future, ready to leave their childhood and their parents' protection behind. My son's cap was somewhere in that pile, and I would never get to touch it, never get to save it as a memento, never get to share in the tradition of keeping some small piece of this day as a reminder of how proud I was, how far we'd both come, how much this moment meant to the man who'd helped make it possible. But maybe that was appropriate. Maybe I didn't deserve a memento from a celebration I'd been allowed to witness but not participate in, a milestone I'd helped him reach but wasn't welcome to claim. The families began to move toward the exits, toward the reception areas where they'd take pictures and share congratulations, and plan celebration dinners that would stretch the joy of this day into the evening. I stayed in my seat a little longer, watching the crowd thin out, working up the courage to try to find him, to offer my congratulations, to give him the watch that had been waiting in my pocket like a promise I was no longer sure I had the right to keep. The families spilled out of the auditorium like water finding its level, spreading across the broad steps and manicured lawns where the real celebration would begin. This was the part I'd been waiting for, the moment when ceremony gave way to intimacy, when formal congratulations became personal embraces, when parents could finally wrap their arms around their children and whisper all the private words of pride and love they'd been holding inside during the public formalities. I clutched the watch box in my jacket pocket, feeling its edges through the fabric like a talisman against uncertainty. My plan had been simple: find him in the crowd, offer my congratulations, present the gift that represented 3 generations of fatherhood passed down like a sacred trust. The speech I'd rehearsed was brief but heartfelt, something about time and tradition and how proud I was of the man he'd become. But as I moved, the clusters of celebrating families, searching for his face among the sea of black gowns and bright smiles, I felt that familiar unease settling in my stomach again. The same feeling I'd had during the drive, during those moments in the auditorium when he'd looked right past me, during all the months of increasingly distant phone calls and shortened text messages. I found him finally, near the old fountain at the center of the campus quad, surrounded by classmates and their families, everyone talking at once in the way people do when they're too excited to wait for conversational turns. He'd taken off his cap, and his hair was slightly mussed from wearing it, making him look younger somehow, more like the boy I remembered tucking into bed all those years ago. His mother was there, of course, and David, both of them beaming with proprietary pride as they posed for pictures with him, their arms around his shoulders like bookends supporting something precious. Other relatives, too. his maternal grandparents, an aunt I recognized from years of holiday gatherings when we'd all been one family instead of fragments of what used to be. I hung back for a moment, waiting for the right opportunity, not wanting to interrupt what was clearly a family moment, but hoping there might be space for me in it somewhere. A classmate's father was taking pictures, directing the group through various configurations. Now just the parents, now add the grandparents, now everyone together. Just the parents. I watched through the viewfinder of someone else's camera as my ex-wife and David flanked our son, the three of them smiling with the easy comfort of people who belonged together, who formed a complete unit that needed no additions to make it whole. The photographer didn't look around for other parents. No one suggested including me in the frame. It was clear to everyone present who he family was, and it wasn't me. When the photo session wound down and the group began to disperse slightly, I saw my chance. I stepped forward, my heart hammering against my ribs, and called out softly, "Son." He turned at the sound of my voice, and for a moment I saw something flicker across his face. Surprise, maybe, or guilt, or just the complicated expression of someone who's been caught off guard by a situation they'd been hoping to avoid. But it was gone quickly, replaced by a polite smile that looked eerily like the one his mother used to give me during the final months of our marriage when she was trying to be kind while keeping her distance. "Hey, Dad," he said, and the word dad sounded different in his mouth than it used to. Formal somehow, obligatory, like a title he was required to use rather than a relationship he cherished. "Sorry, we're running late." Running late. To what? To where? I looked around at the leisurely pace of the celebration, at families taking their time with photographs and conversations, at the unhurried way everyone was savoring this milestone moment. No one else seemed to be in a hurry to be anywhere else. "I just wanted to congratulate you," I said, working to keep my voice steady, to sound like a confident father rather than a man begging for scraps of attention from his own son. "I'm so proud of you. I brought something I wanted to give you." I reached into my pocket for the watch box, but before I could pull it out completely, David materialized at my son's side like he'd been summoned. He placed a hand on my son's shoulder with the casual familiarity of established intimacy, the gesture both protective and possessive. "Ready to go, buddy?" David asked, not looking at me, addressing my son like I wasn't standing right there holding a gift I'd been planning to give for months. "Dot." My son glanced at the partially visible box in my hand, then away, then back at Vid with something that looked like relief. "Yeah, let's head out." I wanted to say everything in that moment, wanted to tell him about all the nights I'd stayed awake when he was sick, all the games I'd never missed, all the sacrifices I'd made to ensure he could stand where he was standing today. Wanted to remind him of the camping trips and the bedtime stories and the way he used to run to me when he scraped his knee, trusting that I could make anything better just by being his father. Wanted to tell him I loved him more than my own life, that watching him succeed was worth every lonely evening in my empty house, every holiday I spent alone, every birthday card I sent that went unacknowledged. Wanted to explain that being his father wasn't something I did, it was who I was, written into my DNA and my daily prayers, and every hope I had for the future. But all I managed to say was, "I brought something for you, something that belonged to my father, something I wanted to pass down." He looked at the box again, and I thought I saw a flicker of curiosity, maybe even longing, but then David's hand tightened slightly on his shoulder, and he shook his head. "I can't really carry anything right now, maybe some other time?" Some other time. The phrase hung in the air between us like a door closing softly but definitively. Not next week, or when I come visit, or even mail it to me. Just some other time, which in the language of polite rejection means never, means this conversation is over, means whatever you're offering isn't wanted badly enough to overcome the inconvenience of accepting it. The words I'd planned to say dried up in my throat like flowers in drought. The watchbox felt suddenly heavy in my hand, not a gift anymore, but evidence of my own foolishness, proof that I'd misunderstood my role in this day, in his life, in the story of who mattered and who didn't. David was already steering him away, toward where his mother waited by a car I didn't recognize. Sleek and new and expensive, the kind of car that suggested financial security and good decisions, and a life that had moved on successfully from whatever came before. "Congratulations again," I called after them. But my son was already walking away. His attention shifted to whatever came next, whoever would be part of his celebration dinner, whichever plans had been made by the people who were still actively included in his life. I stood there holding the watch box like an artifact from a civilization that had vanished while I wasn't looking, watching my son disappear into a future that had been carefully constructed to exclude me. The weight of what I'd wanted to give him became unbearable, not just the physical weight of the watch, but the emotional weight of tradition interrupted, of love offered and declined, of a father's blessing that wasn't wanted badly enough to pause for Dot. Around me, other families continued their celebrations, but I was no longer part of that community of shared joy. I was just a man standing alone on a college campus, holding a gift no one wanted, trying to figure out how to get back to my car without anyone noticing that I was crying. I stayed by the fountain after they left, telling myself I was just collecting myself, just taking a moment to appreciate the beauty of the campus on such a perfect day. But really, I was hoping he might circle back, that whatever plans they were rushing off to might be delayed, that he'd remember the gift I'd tried to give him and return to claim it properly, with time to hear the story that came with it. The watch box sat heavy in my pocket, growing heavier with each passing minute. Around me, other families continued their celebrations with the unhurried joy of people who belonged exactly where they were. A GRA mother wiped happy tears from her eyes while her grandson showed her his diploma. A father lifted his daughter off the ground in a bear hug that made her laugh and protest that he was wrinkling her gown. A mother carefully adjusted her son's honor cords while he tolerated her fussing with the patient smile of someone who knew he was loved. I watched these ordinary moments of extraordinary love and felt like I was looking through a window at a life I used to have, a role I used to play. There had been a time when I was the father straightening ties and taking pictures and being trusted with the small intimacies that bind families together. But that time felt distant now, like something that had happened to someone else, in another life, before I became whatever I was now. 20 minutes passed, then 30. The crowd began to thin as families drifted away to restaurants and celebrations, carrying their graduates off to private parties where the real toasts would be made, where the true feelings would be shared, where the people who really mattered would speak the words that would be remembered years from now. I finally admitted to myself what I'd known from the moment David's hand touched my son's shoulder. He wasn't coming back. Whatever obligation he'd felt to acknowledge my presence at his graduation had been fulfilled with those few polite words. The dismissal had been gentle but complete, delivered with the kind of practiced politeness that makes rejection almost sound like kindness. I walked back toward the parking area where I'd left my car that morning, when the day had still held promise, when I'd still believed that showing up would be enough, that love and history and 22 years of fatherhood would count for something in the final accounting. The oak tree I'd parked under looked the same, but everything else had changed. The world had rearranged itself around the new reality of my irrelevance. As I approached my car, I saw them in the distance, loading into David's sleek sedan. Even from 50 yards away, I could see the easy way they moved together, the unconscious choreography of people who shared daily life, who knew each other's rhythms and habits and preferences. David held the door for my ex-wife with the courtesy of established affection. My son folded his long frame into the back seat with the casual comfort of someone who belonged there, who was going somewhere he wanted to be, with people he chose to be with. I stood by my car and watched them pull away, waiting for someone to look back, to wave, to acknowledge that I was still there, still part of this story, even if only in the margins. But the car simply disappeared around a curve in the campus road, carrying my son toward whatever celebration they'd planned, whatever restaurant they'd chosen, whatever private moments of joy and pride and family closeness I wouldn't be part of. The silence they left behind was heavier than any insult could have been. Anger I could have fought against, cruelty I could have challenged, even indifference I could have tried to overcome. But this polite dismissal, this gentle erasure, this careful kindness that nonetheless excluded me completely. There was no defense against it, no appeal to file, no argument to make. I got into my car and sat there for a long time, engine off, windows down, listening to the sounds of the campus settling into afternoon quiet. The watch box sat on the passenger seat where I'd placed it that morning with such hope, Such certainty that by evening it would be on my son's wrist, connecting him to his grandfather's memory and his father's love and the continuity of generations. Instead, it sat unopened, unwanted, a symbol of connections that had been severed so gradually I hadn't noticed until it was too late to repair them. My father's gone. FT to me meant to become my gift to my son, now just another possession in a life that seemed increasingly full of things that used to matter but didn't anymore. When I finally started the engine, it sputtered and coughed like it too understood the futility of our presence here, the pointlessness of our journey. The old car had carried me faithfully to countless moments in my son's life. First days of school, baseball games, parent-teacher conferences, birthday parties. But today felt like the last time it would be needed for fatherly duties. There would be no more occasions to attend, no more milestones to witness, no more opportunities to prove that I still mattered in his story. The drive home stretched longer than the morning journey. Each mile weighted with the accumulation of small rejections and quiet dismissals that had led to this moment. The highway that had seemed like a path toward celebration now felt like a retreat from a battle I hadn't known I was losing until I'd already lost. I drove slowly, in no hurry to return to the empty house that waited for me, to the silence that would greet me there, to the evening I would spend alone while my son celebrated his achievement with the people who had replaced me in his affections. The radio played songs I didn't recognize, music from a generation that was moving forward without needing my approval or understanding or presence. By the time I reached my driveway, the joy I'd carried that morning was completely gone, replaced by a hollow ache that settled in my chest like a weight I would carry forever. The house looked smaller somehow, more temporary, like a place I was just passing through rather than a home I'd built for a family that no longer existed. I sat in my car for a few more minutes, watching the sun begin its descent toward evening, listening to the neighborhood sounds of other people's lives canoeing around me. Somewhere my son was laughing at someone else's jokes, accepting someone else's congratulations, basking in someone else's pride. The celebration of his achievement was happening without me, would be remembered without me, would become part of family lore that I would never hear. The silence that had started in that moment by the fountain followed me into the house, where it settled into every room like dust, coating everything with the residue of absence, of love that had nowhere to go, of a father's heart that had forgotten how to beat for anything other than a son who no longer needed or wanted what it had to offer. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the watchbox in front of me, its leather surface worn smooth by my handling, by the nervous way I'd carried it all day like a prayer that hadn't been answered. The house was quieter than usual, if that was possible. Not just empty of sound, but empty of purpose, like a theater after the last performance has ended and the audience has gone home. I opened the box and lifted out my father's watch, feeling its familiar weight in my palm. The silver had tarnished slightly over the years, and the leather band showed the creases where my father's wrist had worn it smooth, but the face was still clear. The hand still moved with the precise reliability that had marked the hours of his life, and mine, and should have marked my son's. I traced the edge of the watch face with my finger, remembering the day my father gave it to me, the ceremony he'd made of it, the way his voice had shaken slightly when he talked about time being the only thing we really give each other. He'd been so proud that day, so certain that he was passing something meaningful to someone who would treasure it, who would understand its significance, who would carry it forward into the next generation. Now it sat in my empty kitchen, a connection with nowhere to connect, a tradition with no one to continue it. My son had walked away from more than just a graduation gift when he'd dismissed me that afternoon. He'd walked away from the story of where he came from, the history that had shaped him, the love that had wanted nothing more than to keep flowing forward through time like a river that never stops moving toward the sea. I set the watch aside and found paper and pen in the drawer where I kept bills and shopping lists and all the mundane correspondence of a life lived alone. But this wasn't mundane. This was the most important letter I would ever write, even if no one ever read it. Even if it never left the drawer I was planning to put it in. I began to write, not with anger. Anger was too simple for what I was feeling, but with the kind of truth that only comes when you have nothing left to lose. when all the careful politeness and strategic silences have been stripped away and only the essential facts remain. My dear son, I wrote, and then stopped, overwhelmed by how strange it felt to claim him that way, to assert a relationship he seemed to have moved beyond. But he was my son, regardless of what he called me now, regardless of who else had stepped into the space I used to occupy. DNA doesn't divorce. Biology doesn't remarry. Love doesn't transfer to someone else's name just because papers get signed and living arrangements change. I told him I was proud of him. Not just for the graduation, though that was part of it, but for the man he'd become, for the strength and intelligence and kindness I'd seen in him, even during those brief, polite moments we'd shared recently. I told him that his success felt like mine too, because I'd been there for the foundation laying, the early lessons, the years of daily love that had helped build the confidence he carried now. I wrote about being present even when he couldn't see me, about the way I'd watched him from the back of the auditorium my heart so full of pride it felt like it might burst. I told him that applause doesn't have to be loud to be real, that love doesn't have to be... David was already steering him away, toward where his mother waited by a car I didn't recognize. Sleek and new and expensive, the kind of car that suggested financial security and good decisions, and a life that had moved on successfully from whatever came before. Congratulations again, I called after them. But my son was already walking away. His attention shifted to whatever came next, whoever would be part of his celebration dinner, whichever plans had been made by the people who were still actively included in his life. I stood there holding the watch box like an artifact from a civilization that had vanished while I wasn't looking, watching my son disappear into a future that had been carefully constructed to exclude me. The weight of what I'd wanted to give him became unbearable. Not just the physical weight of the watch, but the emotional weight of tradition interrupted, of love offered and declined, of a father's blessing that wasn't wanted badly enough to pause for dot. Around me, other families continued their celebrations, but I was no longer part of that community of shared joy. I was just a man standing alone on a college campus, holding a gift no one wanted, trying to figure out how to get back to my car without anyone noticing that I was crying. I stayed by the fountain after they left, telling myself I was just collecting myself, just taking a moment to appreciate the beauty of the campus on such a perfect day. But really I was hoping he might circle back, that whatever plans they were rushing off to might be delayed, that he'd remember the gift I'd tried to give him and return to claim it properly, with time to hear the story that came with it. The watch box sat heavy in my pocket, growing heavier with each passing minute. Around me, other families continued their celebrations with the unhurried joy of people who belonged exactly where they were. A GRA mother wiped happy tears from her eyes while her grandson showed her his diploma. A father lifted his daughter off the ground in a bear hug that made her laugh and protest that he was wrinkling her gown. A mother carefully adjusted her son's honor cords while he tolerated her fussing with the patient smile of someone who knew he was loved. I watched these ordinary moments of extraordinary love and felt like I was looking through a window at a life I used to have, a role I used to play. There had been a time when I was the father straightening ties and taking pictures and being trusted with the small intimacies that bind families together. But that time felt distant now, like something that had happened to someone else, in another life, before I became whatever I was now. 20 minutes passed. Then 30. The crowd began to thin as families drifted away to restaurants and celebrations, carrying their graduates off to private parties where the real toasts would be made, where the true feelings would be shared, where the people who really mattered would speak the words that would be remembered years from now. I finally admitted to myself what I'd known from the moment David's hand touched my son's shoulder. He wasn't coming back. Whatever obligation he'd felt to acknowledge my presence at his graduation had been fulfilled with those few polite words. The dismissal had been gentle but complete, delivered with the kind of practiced politeness that makes rejection almost sound like kindness. I walked back toward the parking area where I'd left my car that morning, when the day had still held promise, when I'd still believed that showing up would be enough, that love and history and 22 years of fatherhood would count for something in the final accounting. The oak tree I'd parked under looked the same, but everything else had changed. The world had rearranged itself around the new reality of my irrelevance, acknowledged to exist, that a father's pride burns just as bright from the shadows as it does from the front row. Then I wrote about the nights he didn't know about, the sacrifices he'd never seen, the winters I'd kept the thermostat low in my own bedroom so I could afford to keep his room warm when he visited, the meals I'd skipped so I could put money in those secret envelopes, building a college fund one lunch at a time, the weekends I'd worked overtime so he could have the cleats he wanted, the calculator he needed, the senior trip he'd dreamed about. I told him about staying awake during his teenage years, not because I was checking up on him, but because I was sending prayers into the darkness, asking whatever forces govern the universe to keep him safe, to help him make good choices, to let him know he was loved even when the miles between our houses made it hard to show him directly. I wrote about hope, how I'd hoped he would call more often, text more frequently, want to spend more time together, how I'd hoped that the divorce wouldn't change the fundamental bond between us, that blood would prove thicker than the complicated waters of adult relationships and new family configurations, how I'd hoped that showing up today would matter, that my presence would mean something, that 22 years of fatherhood would earn me a place beside him in his moment of triumph. But I also wrote about acceptance, about understanding that he was building his own life now, making his own choices about who to include and who to keep at arm's length. About recognizing that sometimes love means letting go, even when letting go feels like dying a little, even when the silence that follows threatens to swallow you whole. I told him that I would always be his father, not because he acknowledged it, but because it was written into every cell of my body, every beat of my heart, every prayer I said, before falling asleep alone, that he could erase me from his celebrations, his photographs, his future plans, but he couldn't erase me from the story of how he became who he was. I was there in his sense of humor, his work ethic, his way of tilting his head when he was thinking hard about something. I was there whether he wanted me to be or not. And finally, I wrote about the watch, about what it had meant to my father, what it had meant to me, what I had hoped it would mean to him, about time being the most precious thing we have to give, and how I had given him all of mine gladly, would give him more if he wanted it, would keep loving him across whatever distance he needed to maintain between us. When I finished writing, my hand was cramped and my eyes were wet, but something in my chest felt lighter, like I'd set down a weight I'd been carrying without realizing how heavy it had become. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the box with the watch, creating a package that contained not just a gift, but a piece of my heart, a fragment of family history, a bridge across the silence that had grown between us. I sealed the box and carried it to my bedroom, where I placed it in the top drawer of the dresser where it had waited that morning. Someday, I told myself, he might want to know what I had tried to give him. Someday he might be curious about the father who had loved him first and longest, who had never stopped believing in him even when he'd stopped believing in me. Or maybe he wouldn't. Maybe the box would stay in that drawer until I died, would be discovered by strangers cleaning out my house, would end up in some estate sale where the watch would be bought by someone who knew nothing about the generations of love it represented. But that was okay too. I had written the letter for me as much as for him, had needed to put the truth down on paper so it would exist somewhere outside my own heart, so it would be real whether anyone ever read it or not. Love doesn't require an audience to be genuine. Pride doesn't need applause to be valid. A father's heart doesn't stop loving just because there's no one left to receive what it has to offer. In the weeks that followed his graduation, I stopped doing the things that had become painful rituals of hope and disappointment. I stopped checking my phone every few minutes for messages that never came. I stopped crafting careful text messages designed to sound casual, while fishing for information about his life, his job search, his plans, his happiness. I stopped refreshing social media to catch glimpses of a life he shared freely with others, but guarded from me. Instead, I began to walk in the mornings. It started as a way to fill the time I used to spend waiting for calls that didn't come, but it became something more important than that. Each morning, just as the sun began to paint the sky in shades of gold and rose, I would step out of my house and into the quiet streets of my neighborhood, where the world felt clean and full of possibility, where my thoughts could stretch out like the road ahead of me. There, quote, something about walking that puts things in perspective. The rhythm of footsteps, the gradual warming of muscles, the way the landscape changes slowly enough that you notice details you miss when you're driving past in a hurry. I began to see my neighborhood differently. The way Mrs. Henderson tended her garden with the patience of someone who understood that beautiful things take time, the way the old oak tree in Miller's yard had grown around the fence line rather than fighting it, finding a way to thrive despite obstacles. During these walks, I thought about what it means to be a father when your child no longer needs or wants your active participation in their life. For 22 years, fatherhood had been about do it. Teaching him to ride a bike, helping with homework, driving him to practices and parties and all the places young people need to go. It had been about providing and protecting and being present for the daily small crises that felt enormous at the time. But now, stripped of all those concrete responsibilities, I was forced to confront the essential question. What does it mean to be a father when fathering as an active verb is no longer welcome? The answer came to me gradually, like dawn breaking slowly across the sky during those morning walks. Being a father, I realized, isn't fundamentally about being seen or acknowledged or thanked. It's not about receiving credit for the sacrifices made or recognition for the love given. It's about the choice to keep loving day after day, regardless of whether that love is returned or even noticed. About waking up each morning and deciding, again, to wish him well in whatever life he's building without you. It's about feeling genuine joy when you hear through mutual friends that he got the job he wanted, even though he didn't call to tell you himself. It's about praying for his happiness and health and success, not because he's asked for your prayers, but because your heart can't help hoping for his good fortune. I thought about my own father during these walks, remembering times when I'd been too busy or too self-absorbed to appreciate what he was offering, too focused on building my own life to see the quiet ways he continued to love me even when I wasn't paying attention. Had there been moments when he felt as invisible as I did now? Times when his love went unacknowledged, his pride unshared, his hopes for connection gently but firmly declined? Probably. Almost certainly. And yet he'd never stopped being my father, never stopped caring about my welfare, never stopped hoping that someday I'd understand the depth of what he felt for me. He'd found a way to love me from whatever distance I needed to maintain, to be proud of me, whether I sought his approval or not, to remain constant in his devotion even when I was too young and foolish to treasure what he offered. That quote is what I needed to learn how to do now, how to love my son the way my father had loved me, quietly, consistently, without conditions or expectations, without needing anything in return except the knowledge that he was well and happy and finding his way in the world. It wasn't easy. Some mornings I still woke up reaching for my phone, still felt the impulse to try to bridge the distance between us with carefully worded messages or casual invitations or offers of help he didn't want. The silence still hurt. The absence still felt like a physical weight in my chest. The knowledge that he was celebrating milestones and facing challenges and living his daily life without any input from me still triggered grief that caught me off guard with its intensity. But alongside the grief, something else was growing. A kind of dignity I hadn't expected, a peace that came from accepting my role as it actually was, rather than mourning the role I wished I still had. I was still his father. That hadn't changed and couldn't change, regardless of custody arrangements or remarriages, or the natural evolution of parent-child relationships as children become adults. The DNA we shared would always connect us, even if we never spoke again. The years I'd spent raising him had shaped who he became, even if someone else was claiming credit for his achievements now. The love I'd given him in childhood had helped build the foundation of confidence and security he was standing on as he built his adult life, even if he'd forgotten where that foundation came from. During one particularly clear morning in late summer, as I walked past the park where I'd taught him to throw a curveball when he was 12, I realized that this was its own form of justice. Not the dramatic kind you see in movies, where wrongs are righted and truth prevails and everyone gets what they deserve, but a quieter kind of justice, the kind that comes from knowing you did your job well even if no one remembers, from loving completely even when that love isn't returned, from maintaining your integrity even when it would be easier to become bitter. My son might never acknowledge the role I played in making him the man he became. He might go through his entire adult life giving credit to others for lessons I taught him, values I instilled in him, love I showed him during the years when his character was still being formed. That was okay. The love had been real whether it was remembered or not. The lessons had taken root whether their source was acknowledged or not. The father I had been to him existed as fact, not opinion, and facts don't require validation to be true. One day he might remember. One day he might want to know about the watch in my dresser drawer, about the letter that waits with it, about the father who never stopped loving him, even when loving him meant accepting invisibility. He might have children of his own, and suddenly understand the fierce, protective, unconditional love that doesn't end just because the child grows up and moves away and builds a new life with new people. Or he might not. He might continue on the path he's chosen, surrounded by the family he's claimed and claimed by, never looking back toward the man who raised him, never wondering about the love that still reaches toward him across the silence like light from a star that continues to shine long after it can no longer be seen. Both possibilities were acceptable to me now. I had learned the difference between being needed and choosing to love, between receiving recognition and maintaining faithfulness, between being visible and being real. A father's love doesn't require an audience. It doesn't need applause or acknowledgement or reciprocation to be genuine and valuable and worthy. It just needs to be true. And mine was true, would always be true, would continue burning steady and bright whether anyone ever noticed it again or not. That's the quiet justice of a father's love. It outlives rejection, survives abandonment, transcends even the deepest betrayal. It becomes its own reward, its own purpose, its own reason for being. As I walked back toward my house that morning, I felt lighter than I had in months. Not because anything had changed in the external circumstances of my life. My son was still distant, I was still alone, the silence between us was still as vast as ever. But because I had finally understood what it meant to be a father in the truest sense, not as a role I performed for an audience, but as a choice I made every day to keep loving someone who might never love me back with the same intensity. That was enough. It had to be enough. And surprisingly, it was.